The late September afternoon had settled over St. Mary Mead with that particular golden quality that makes English villages appear as though they have been painted by a romantic artist with a fondness for warm light and gentle shadows. The annual harvest garden party at the vicarage was proceeding with the comfortable predictability that the residents of St. Mary Mead had come to expect from such occasions. Ladies in sensible frocks discussing the merits of various jam recipes, gentlemen in well-worn tweeds debating the cricket season, and children weaving between the adults with the sort of purposeful energy that suggested mischief was being contemplated, if not yet executed. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary wicker chair beneath the ancient oak tree, her knitting needles clicking with the steady rhythm of a metronome as she worked on what appeared to be a particularly challenging section of a baby's booty. Her pale blue eyes, however, were far from focused on her handiwork. Instead, they moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime observing human nature in all its fascinating complexity. The vicarage garden was looking particularly well this year, she reflected. Mrs. Clement had outdone herself with the dahlias, and the late roses were putting on quite a show despite the recent rain. The refreshment tent had been positioned with strategic precision near the French windows, allowing easy access to the house while providing an excellent vantage point for observing the comings and goings of the party guests. It was from this elevated position that Miss Marple first noticed the woman who would, in a matter of hours, transform their peaceful afternoon into something far more sinister. The stranger approached the garden gate with a sort of measured hesitation that suggested both familiarity and uncertainty. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, well dressed in a manner that spoke of London shops rather than country tailors. Her hat was stylish without being ostentatious. Her gloves were of good quality leather, and her shoes showed the sort of careful maintenance that indicated either modest means stretched carefully or substantial means managed wisely. What caught Miss Marple's attention, however, was not the woman's appearance, though that was certainly noteworthy, but rather her behavior. She paused at the gate for nearly a full minute, her gaze sweeping across the assembled guests with what appeared to be a mixture of recognition and apprehension. When Mrs. Clement approached to welcome her, the woman's smile seemed to require considerable effort, as though she were an actress who had forgotten her lines and was improvising desperately. "Miss Marple," called Mrs. Clement from across the lawn, "do come and meet Mrs. Fortescue. She tells me she spent several summers here as a child and has such fond memories of our little village." Miss Marple carefully secured her knitting and made her way across the grass, noting as she did so that Mrs. Fortescue's eyes had fixed upon her with an intensity that seemed rather excessive for a casual introduction. The woman's handshake was firm but brief, and there was something in her manner that reminded Miss Marple of a cat in an unfamiliar house, alert, wary, and ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. "How delightful to meet you, Miss Marple," Mrs. Fortescue said, her voice carrying just the faintest trace of an accent that might have been Scottish or perhaps Northern English. "Mrs. Clement tells me you've lived in St. Mary Mead all your life. You must have seen so many changes over the years." "Indeed I have," Miss Marple replied gently. "Though I often think that while the faces change, human nature remains remarkably consistent. People are much the same whether it's 1920 or 1950, don't you find?" Something flickered in Mrs. Fortescue's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "Yes," she said slowly. "Yes, I suppose that's quite true." The conversation might have continued in this vein, but Mrs. Clement had already moved on to introduce Mrs. Fortescue to Colonel Bantry, leaving Miss Marple to observe from a polite distance. What she observed was increasingly interesting. Mrs. Fortescue moved through the gathering with the skill of someone accustomed to social situations, yet there was an underlying tension in her manner that suggested she was searching for something or someone specific. Near the refreshment tent, young Cherry Baker had been assigned the task of managing the visitors' book. a leather-bound volume that Mrs. Clement had optimistically hoped would create a record of their social occasions for posterity. Most guests signed with the casual flourish of people fulfilling a social obligation, but Mrs. Fortescue approached the task with unusual deliberation. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself strategically near the jam stall, watched as the woman picked up the pen, hesitated, wrote something, paused for nearly 30 seconds while consulting a small notebook from her handbag, then wrote a second line beneath the first. The entire process took several minutes, during which Mrs. Fortescue glanced repeatedly at the other guests as though ensuring she was not being observed too closely. Curious, Miss Marple murmured to herself, a habit that had served her well over the years when she needed to think aloud without appearing to do so. What's curious, Aunt Jane? Her nephew Raymond had appeared at her elbow, carrying 2 cups of tea with the careful concentration of someone who had learned from bitter experience that Mrs. Clement's best china was not to be trifled with. "The lady who just signed the visitor's book," Miss Marple replied, accepting her tea gratefully. She signed it twice with what appeared to be 2 different names. Most unusual behavior for a garden party, wouldn't you say? Raymond followed her gaze to where Mrs. Fortescue was now engaged in animated conversation with the vicar about the restoration of the church bell tower. Perhaps she made an error and corrected it. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, though her tone suggested she found this explanation less than satisfactory. Though it would be a most peculiar error to require an entirely separate signature line. The afternoon progressed with the gentle rhythm of such events. The tombola proved popular, particularly after Colonel Bantry won a bottle of Mrs. Price Ridley's elderflower wine and declared it absolutely first-rate, a pronouncement that sent several ladies scurrying to purchase tickets. The children's games had reached that critical point where supervision became essential to prevent either tears or bloodshed, and the vicar was making subtle preparations for his traditional closing remarks about the church roof fund. It was during this peaceful interlude that the first truly discordant note was struck. Mrs. Fortescue had been engaged in what appeared to be a pleasant conversation with Miss Weatherby about the challenges of growing roses in clay soil when her demeanor changed abruptly. Her face paled, her hand went instinctively to her throat, and she took a step backward as though she had encountered something alarming. Following her gaze, Miss Marple spotted the source of the disturbance. A man in his early 60s had just entered the garden through the side gate, the one that led from the lane behind the church. He was well dressed in the manner of a successful businessman, with silver hair and the sort of confident bearing that suggested a life of giving orders rather than taking them. What was most notable about him, however, was the effect his presence had on Mrs. Fortescue, who appeared to be struggling with the decision of whether to flee or stand her ground. The man's eyes swept the gathering until they found Mrs. Fortescue, at which point his expression shifted from casual interest to something far more focused. He began moving toward her with the deliberate pace of someone who had found what he was looking for and intended to claim it. Miss Marple, whose experience with human drama had taught her to recognize the signs of an impending confrontation, quietly moved closer to the refreshment tent, positioning herself where she could observe without appearing to do so. The meeting, when it came, was conducted in voices too low for casual eavesdropping, but Miss Marple's hearing, despite her years, remained excellent. She caught fragments of conversation that suggested a relationship of long standing and considerable complexity. "Told you never to contact me again. Circumstances have changed. Won't be threatened. Think very carefully about." The exchange lasted perhaps 3 minutes before Mrs. Fortescue turned abruptly and walked toward the house, leaving the man standing alone near the rose arbor with an expression of barely controlled anger. He remained there for several moments, his hands clenched at his sides, before following her path toward the vicarage. Miss Marple, who had developed an instinct for such things over the years, felt the familiar stirring of unease that preceded most of the unpleasant events she'd encountered in her long life. She glanced around the garden, noting the positions of the other guests, the proximity of potential witnesses, and the various routes of entry and exit from the vicarage grounds. It was at this moment that young Cherry Baker approached her with the visitor's book, her face flushed with excitement and confusion. "Miss Marple," she whispered urgently, "you must look at this. That lady, Mrs. Fortescue, she signed the book twice, but with different names. First as Mrs. Eleanor Fortescue, and then, right underneath, as Eleanor Blackwood. Do you think she made a mistake?" Miss Marple examined the entries carefully. The handwriting was identical, the timing sequential, but the names were distinctly different. More intriguingly, the surname Blackwood stirred a memory, something from years past, a scandal or tragedy that had touched St. Mary Mead in some peripheral way. "No, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "I don't think it was a mistake at all. I think Mrs. Fortescue, or Miss Blackwood, as she apparently once was, has returned to St. Mary Mead for a very specific purpose. The question is whether that purpose is as innocent as attending a garden party." Before Cherry could respond, a scream pierced the afternoon air, a sound so sharp and unexpected that it seemed to freeze every conversation, halt every movement, and draw every eye toward its source. The scream had come from inside the vicarage. Miss Marple, moving with surprising speed for a woman of her years, was among the first to reach the French windows. What she found in Mrs. Clement's morning room would remain etched in her memory for years to come. Mrs. Eleanor Fortescue, or Blackwood, lay crumpled beside the writing desk, her stylish hat askew, her gloved hands clutched around a letter opener that protruded from her chest at an angle that suggested both violence and precision. The silver-haired man stood frozen in the doorway to the hall, his face a mask of shock that appeared entirely genuine. Blood stained the Persian carpet, and scattered across the floor were the contents of Mrs. Fortescue's handbag, a compact, a small notebook, several letters tied with ribbon, and a photograph of a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to the victim. "Nobody move," commanded Colonel Bantry, his military training asserting itself in the crisis. "Someone telephone for the police and the doctor, and everyone else, please step back from the scene." But Miss Marple, who had positioned herself near the writing desk, had already begun her own quiet investigation. Her eyes moved methodically across the room, noting the position of the furniture, the direction of the blood spatter, and the curious fact that Mrs. Fortescue's notebook lay open to a page containing what appeared to be a list of names. Names that Miss Marple recognized as belonging to several prominent residents of St. Mary Mead. At the top of the list, underlined twice in red ink, was a name that made Miss Marple's breath catch. Margaret Clement. The vicar's wife, who at that very moment was directing the evacuation of the morning room with admirable efficiency, apparently had some connection to the dead woman that went far deeper than a casual meeting at a garden party. As the afternoon sun slanted through the French windows, casting long shadows across the scene of violence, Miss Marple reflected that, once again, the peaceful surface of village life had been shattered by the darker currents that ran beneath. The woman who had signed the visitor's book twice was dead, but the mystery of why she had done so, and why she had returned to St. Mary Mead after what appeared to be many years, was only beginning to unfold. In her experience, people who used two names usually had two lives, and when such people met violent ends, the explanation invariably lay in the collision between those separate existences. The question now was which of Mrs. Fortescue's lives had caught up with her, and whether the residents of St. Mary Mead were prepared for the secrets that were about to be revealed. The arrival of Inspector Slack and the police constabulary transformed the gentle afternoon gathering into something far more sinister. The inspector, a man whose brusque efficiency often masked a tendency toward hasty conclusions, strode through the French windows with the air of someone who expected village murders to present themselves as simply as stolen chickens or poached rabbits. Dr. Haydock, summoned from his surgery in the village, completed his examination with professional dispatch and straightened with a grave expression that confirmed what everyone already knew. Dead approximately 20 minutes, he reported to Inspector Slack, carefully avoiding disturbing the scene further. Single wound, precisely placed. The weapon appears to be Mrs. Clement's letter opener from the writing desk. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were about. The silver-haired man who had followed Mrs. Fortescue into the house stood under police guard in the hallway, his initial shock having given way to a carefully controlled composure that Miss Marple found almost as interesting as his earlier distress. When questioned, he identified himself as James Blackwood, a London solicitor, and admitted with obvious reluctance that the deceased had been his estranged wife. "We separated 5 years ago," Blackwood explained to Inspector Slack, his voice carrying the measured tones of a man accustomed to legal proceedings. "Eleanor had difficulties, financial irregularities in her business affairs. I came down today because she had written requesting a meeting about our divorce settlement." Inspector Slack, who preferred his cases to present obvious culprits, seized upon this information with evident satisfaction. "And this meeting, it didn't go well, I take it?" "She became agitated when she saw me," Blackwood admitted. "Accused me of following her, of trying to interfere with her new life. We exchanged words in the garden, yes, but when I followed her into the house to continue our discussion privately, I found her already—" He gestured helplessly toward the morning room. Outside on the lawn, the remaining guests had formed into tight clusters of whispered speculation. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose appetite for scandal was legendary throughout St. Mary Mead, held court near the refreshment tent with an audience that included Miss Weatherby and several of the younger village women. "Mark my words," she declared in tones that carried farther than she perhaps intended. "It's always the husband in these affairs. Estranged or not, there's usually money involved. These London women with their airs and their secrets, well, one knows what sort of lives they lead." Miss Weatherby nodded vigorously, her eyes bright with excitement. "And did you see how she signed the visitor's book? Cherry Baker told me she used 2 different names. Most peculiar behavior, if you ask me." Young Cherry, pale but clearly thrilled to be at the center of such dramatic events, clutched the leather-bound visitor's book as though it were evidence in a capital case. "She spent ever so long writing in it," she confided to the assembled ladies. "First, Mrs. Eleanor Fortescue, and then Eleanor Blackwood right underneath, almost as if she couldn't decide who she wanted to be." Miss Marple, who had positioned herself within earshot while appearing to tend to her knitting, found this observation particularly illuminating. A woman who signed 2 names was often a woman with 2 lives, and the collision between those lives frequently proved fatal. But which life had Eleanor Blackwood been trying to reclaim, and which had she been attempting to escape? More intriguingly, Miss Marple had noticed Inspector Slack's cursory examination of the notebook that had spilled from the victim's handbag. The inspector had dismissed it as just names and addresses, but Miss Marple had glimpsed enough to see that Margaret Clement's name topped the list, underlined in red ink with an urgency that suggested unfinished business. Griselda Clement sat on a garden bench near the rose arbor, her usual vivacious manner replaced by a stillness that bordered on shock. Her husband, the vicar, hovered nearby with the sort of protective concern that suggested he knew more about his wife's distress than the mere discovery of a body in their morning room might warrant. When Miss Marple approached with gentle inquiries about tea and comfort, she noticed that Griselda's hands trembled, not with shock, but with something that looked remarkably like fear. The younger woman's eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, held the trapped look of someone who had seen their past walking toward them across a garden and knew that no amount of prayer or pretense would make it disappear again. "Such a terrible shock for you, my dear," Miss Marple murmured, settling beside her on the bench. Though I couldn't help but notice that Mrs. Fortescue seemed to know her way about the house rather well for a first-time visitor. Griselda's teacup rattled against its saucer. I wouldn't know about that. I was busy with the guests. But Miss Marple, whose long experience with human nature had taught her to recognize the difference between surprise and recognition, filed this response away with all the other small deceptions that were beginning to accumulate around Eleanor Blackwood's final afternoon. The truth, she suspected, would prove far more complex than Inspector Slack's straightforward theory of an estranged husband's revenge. Inspector Slack had established his temporary headquarters in the vicar's study, transforming the peaceful sanctuary of theological contemplation into something resembling a military command post. His notebook lay open beside the visitor's book, which he regarded with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had already solved his case. The double signature that had so intrigued Miss Marple was, in his view, merely evidence of a disturbed woman's confused state of mind, hardly relevant to what appeared to be a straightforward case of domestic violence. James Blackwood's formal interview proceeded along predictable lines. The solicitor maintained his composure admirably, though Miss Marple, who had positioned herself in the adjoining library with her knitting, noticed the strain in his voice when he described following his wife into the house. She became agitated the moment she saw me, Blackwood explained, his legal training evident in his precise choice of words. Accused me of following her, of interfering with what she called her new life. We exchanged heated words in the garden, yes, but when I followed her inside to continue our discussion privately, I found her already collapsed beside the writing desk. Inspector Slack leaned back in his chair with evident satisfaction. And you expect me to believe the real murderer conveniently departed just moments before your arrival? I expect you to investigate properly, Blackwood replied with quiet dignity. Eleanor was genuinely frightened of someone in this village. She wrote as much in her letter requesting this meeting. She claimed to be in danger from people who knew about her past. Through the partially open door, Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily. People who knew about her past. That observation aligned perfectly with her own growing suspicions about the list of names in Eleanor's notebook. When Griselda Clement was summoned for questioning, Miss Marple noted the younger woman's careful preparation. Fresh lipstick applied with a slightly unsteady hand, her usual vivacious manner replaced by a composure that seemed to require considerable effort to maintain. "You're quite certain you had no prior acquaintance with Mrs. Blackwood?" Inspector Slack asked, consulting his notes. "None whatsoever," Griselda replied, though her fingers worried the handkerchief in her lap. "We spoke briefly about the garden and the weather, nothing more. I was supervising the children's games when it happened." Miss Marple, who had spent decades observing the subtle signs of human distress, recognized the particular quality of Griselda's nervousness. This was not the shock of discovering a body in one's morning room, but something deeper, the fear of someone whose carefully constructed present was being threatened by an unwelcome past. During a brief recess in the questioning, Miss Marple managed to examine Eleanor's belongings more closely. Among the scattered contents of the handbag, she discovered a small photograph tucked into the victim's compact, two young women standing beneath the very oak tree that had sheltered the afternoon's festivities. One was clearly a younger Eleanor Blackwood. The other woman's face had been deliberately scratched out with what appeared to be a pin or knife point, suggesting either rage or desperate need to forget. More significantly, Miss Marple noticed something that had escaped Inspector Slack's cursory examination, a distinctive smear of yellowish clay on the heel of Eleanor's right shoe. The vicarage garden, like most of St. Mary Mead's established properties, rested on rich, dark loam. Yellow clay was found only near the old quarry on the village's outskirts, suggesting Eleanor had visited somewhere else before making her dramatic appearance at the garden party. "Most curious," she murmured to young Constable Pork, who was guarding the evidence. "If Mrs. Blackwood arrived directly from the station by taxi, as she told Mrs. Clement, how did she acquire quarry clay on her shoes?" Dr. Haydock approached her with a troubled expression as the afternoon shadows lengthened. "Jane, something's been bothering me about the wound. The angle of entry suggests the killer was quite tall, or the victim was in a vulnerable position when struck, but the blood spatter indicates she was standing upright when attacked. Which would suggest, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, that Mrs. Blackwood knew her attacker well enough to turn her back without fear. The wound entered from behind and slightly above, did it not? Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of old George, the vicarage gardener, who had been summoned to give his statement. His testimony proved more illuminating than Inspector Slack had anticipated. Saw the lady arrive, bold as brass through the front gate, George reported, clearly enjoying his moment of importance. But she wasn't the only stranger about today. Earlier, I spotted a fellow lurking near the quarry path, watching the house through the hedge. Rough-looking sort with a pronounced limp. Thought he might be eyeing the lead on the roof, but he vanished when the party began. Miss Marple filed this information away with growing interest. A limping stranger near the quarry would explain both the clay on Eleanor's shoes and her earlier whereabouts. More importantly, it suggested the victim had arranged to meet someone before confronting whatever demons awaited her at the vicarage. As evening approached and the last guests departed, Miss Marple walked slowly home through the familiar lanes. The investigation was revealing layers of complexity that Inspector Slack seemed determined to ignore in his eagerness to arrest James Blackwood. Eleanor had returned to St. Mary Mead with specific purpose, carrying a list of names and enough fear to request a meeting with her estranged husband. Someone in the village had been desperately afraid of what she might reveal, afraid enough to kill. The woman who had signed the visitor's book twice was keeping her secret still, but Miss Marple sensed that the truth lay not in Eleanor Fortescue's present circumstances, but in Eleanor Blackwood's carefully buried past. The following morning brought Inspector Slack's expected announcement echoing through St. Mary Mead. James Blackwood had been formally arrested and charged with his wife's murder. The evidence, as the inspector explained with considerable satisfaction at the Blue Boar Inn, seemed overwhelming. The estranged husband had followed his wife to the village, engaged in a heated public argument, pursued her into the house, and been discovered standing over her body within minutes of the fatal blow. His protestations of innocence struck Inspector Slack as precisely the sort of transparent deception one expected from murderers caught in the act. Miss Marple, who had stopped by the inn ostensibly to purchase wool from Mrs. Bantry's charitable sale, listened to this confident recitation with the polite attention that masked profound skepticism. Her subsequent morning was spent in what appeared to be routine social calls, though each visit served a specific investigative purpose that would have impressed even Inspector Slack had he possessed the wisdom to observe her methods. Her first destination was Cherry Baker's cottage, where concern for the young woman's emotional state provided perfect cover for more detailed questioning about Eleanor's behavior with the visitor's book. Cherry's revelation proved illuminating. Eleanor had not simply signed twice in confusion, but had methodically searched through all the previous entries, tracing her finger down page after page as though hunting for familiar names from her past. She seemed particularly interested in the spring entries, Cherry confided over tea. Kept checking something in her own little notebook, as though comparing names. It took her ever so long, Miss Marple, almost as if she was making sure certain people had been here recently. This systematic search suggested Eleanor had returned to St. Mary Mead with specific targets in mind. People whose presence she needed to confirm before proceeding with whatever confrontation had brought her back to the village after so many years. Miss Marple's next stop was the library, where the parish records yielded their secrets to patient investigation. The marriage register from 1935 contained the confirmation she had suspected. Eleanor Blackwood's signature appeared as witness to the wedding of Margaret Miller and Leonard Clement. The handwriting was bold and confident, quite unlike the hesitant scrawl in yesterday's visitor's book, suggesting a woman who had once moved through this community with certainty and purpose. Armed with this crucial connection, Miss Marple encountered James Blackwood sitting dejectedly on a bench near the village green. His appearance was that of a man whose world had collapsed overnight, Yet his explanation of Eleanor's final letter provided essential context for her return. She wrote about finding the missing piece, he revealed, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Said she needed legal advice before confronting someone about an old debt being called in. Eleanor had years she never spoke about Miss Marple, people she claimed to have forgotten but clearly hadn't. Their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of a rough-looking man with a pronounced limp emerging from the Blue Boar's direction. He paused upon seeing Blackwood, his eyes narrowing with apparent recognition before turning abruptly down a side alley. When questioned, Blackwood admitted the face seemed familiar, though he couldn't place the connection. Miss Marple watched the stranger disappear with growing certainty that all the elements of Eleanor's final day were converging toward a revelation that would shake St. Mary Mead's carefully maintained respectability. The limping man, the quarry clay on Eleanor's shoes, the list of names, and now the confirmed connection to Griselda Clement through the marriage witness, all pointed toward secrets that someone had been desperate enough to kill to protect. That afternoon, while tending her garden, Miss Marple received the visitor she had been expecting. Griselda Clement stood at her gate, pale and trembling, clutching a small leather-bound diary that looked suspiciously familiar. Her composure, so carefully maintained during Inspector Slack's questioning, had finally cracked under the weight of guilt and terror. "Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears, "I need your help. I took this from the morning room before the police arrived. I was so frightened of what it might contain, but now I don't know what to do with it." Miss Marple ushered her inside, recognizing the moment when secrets could no longer be contained. As Griselda collapsed into the armchair, weeping with the release of long-suppressed fear, Miss Marple prepared tea with steady hands. The diary, she suspected, contained the final pieces of Eleanor Blackwood's puzzle, the evidence that had brought her back to St. Mary Mead and ultimately to her death. The investigation was about to take a turn that would force even Inspector Slack to reconsider his hasty conclusions about obvious culprits and straightforward motives. The diary that Griselda Clement placed on Miss Marple's tea table seemed to pulse with barely contained secrets, its worn, leather-binding testament to years of careful record-keeping. As Griselda's composure finally cracked under the weight of her concealed knowledge, Miss Marple prepared herself for revelations that would reshape her understanding of Eleanor Blackwood's final day. "I knew her as Nell Miller," Griselda began, her voice barely steady. "We shared lodgings in London for nearly 2 years before I met Leonard. She was older, more worldly, and she had come to the city fleeing some scandal here in St. Mary Mead. We both worked as companions, first to various elderly ladies, then together at Enderby Hall under old Lady Ashford." Miss Marple opened the diary with reverent care, noting immediately that the entries spanned nearly 20 years, beginning with the neat, hopeful handwriting of a young woman and evolving into the sharp, calculating script she had observed in Eleanor's final notebook. The early pages painted a picture of 2 young women struggling to maintain respectability in reduced circumstances, but it was the entries from August 1934 that revealed the catastrophe that had shaped Eleanor's entire subsequent life. "Lady Ashford's diamond bracelet disappeared during a house party," Griselda continued, her words tumbling out with the relief of long-suppressed confession. "Both Nell and I were under suspicion. The police investigation was thorough but inconclusive. Lady Ashford dismissed us both without references, effectively destroying our prospects for respectable employment." The diary entries from that period revealed Eleanor's growing bitterness, but also something more disturbing, her gradual realization that she had been deliberately framed. A crucial entry from September 1934 read, "Saw the quarry keeper's boy watching the hall that night. He knows something, saw someone else in the corridors, but he's too frightened to speak. They've threatened his father's position." Miss Marple looked up sharply. The quarry keeper's son. Would that be the Danes family? George Danes, yes. He would have been about 15 then, always skulking about the estate. There was an accident at the quarry soon after. Something about stolen equipment and a motor car. Young Danes was badly injured and left with a permanent limp. The family lost their cottage, and the boy disappeared from the village entirely. The implications were staggering. Eleanor had spent 20 years believing herself wrongly accused, and now she had returned with evidence to prove her innocence. The limping stranger who had been seen near the quarry was George Danes, grown into a bitter man who had finally agreed to provide testimony about what he had witnessed that long-ago night at Enderby Hall. Miss Marple turned to the diary's final entries, dated just days before Eleanor's death. The handwriting was shakier now, reflecting years of hardship, but the purpose was clear. Danes has agreed to meet me at the old quarry. He saw everything that night, knows who really took the bracelet. Says he kept silent to protect his family, but conscience finally overcame fear. With his testimony, I can clear my name and expose the real thief. But Eleanor didn't come back merely seeking vindication, Miss Marple observed, studying the careful lists of names and notations throughout the diary. She had also discovered that the person who framed her had built an entire respectable life on the foundation of that theft. The bracelet was valuable enough to establish someone in comfortable circumstances, perhaps even fund a suitable marriage or social position. Griselda's face went ashen. You think someone in St. Mary Mead was the real thief? Someone still living here? Miss Marple closed the diary thoughtfully. After Griselda's departure, she made her way to the old quarry, following the same path Eleanor had taken on her final afternoon. The site was overgrown and seemingly abandoned, but the yellow clay near the main pit showed clear signs of recent disturbance. 2 sets of footprints, one small and healed, the other larger with the characteristic drag of a limping gait. It was while examining the churned mud that Miss Marple made her most significant discovery. A small silver button, distinctive in its design, a fox's head with ruby eyes. She recognized it immediately as belonging to a waistcoat she had seen many times at village functions, worn by someone who prided himself on his sporting attire and unassailable reputation. The button belonged to Colonel Bantry. The discovery sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. If the Colonel had been present at Eleanor's meeting with Danes, then the web of connections was far more complex than a simple case of historical theft. Colonel Bantry had been a young man in 1934, newly returned from India, with modest means that had somehow expanded into considerable wealth by the time he purchased his estate and established himself as a pillar of St. Mary Mead society. As Miss Marple carefully wrapped the button in her handkerchief, she realized that Eleanor Blackwood's return had threatened not just individual reputations, but the entire, carefully constructed social order of the village. Someone had killed her not to prevent blackmail, but to prevent justice, to ensure that a 20-year-old crime remained buried along with its victim. The woman who had signed the visitor's book twice had indeed been living 2 lives. Eleanor Fortescue, the respectable widow seeking legal advice from her estranged husband, and Eleanor Blackwood, the wronged woman determined to reclaim her stolen honor. Her killer had ensured that neither identity would survive to tell the truth. But truth, as Miss Marple well knew, had a way of emerging despite the most careful attempts at concealment. The diary, the quarry meeting, and now the Colonel's button formed a chain of evidence that would ultimately lead to justice, though perhaps not in the way Inspector Slack anticipated. The real murderer was still walking free among them, protected by respectability and 20 years of carefully maintained deception. As evening shadows lengthened across the quarry, Miss Marple began her careful climb back to the village, acutely aware that her harmless appearance was no longer a guarantee of safety. She had found the loose thread in St. Mary Mead's tapestry, and pulling it would unravel secrets that someone had already killed to protect. Miss Marple spent a restless night contemplating Colonel Bantry's distinctive silver button, now carefully wrapped in tissue paper within her work basket. While the evidence appeared damning, Her years of experience had taught her that the most obvious conclusions were frequently the most misleading. A button could be lost innocently, yet its presence at the quarry where Eleanor had met George Danes suggested a connection that demanded careful investigation. Morning brought an unexpected visitor in the person of Mrs. Bantry herself, who appeared at Miss Marple's garden gate in a state of considerable agitation. Her usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled panic, and she clutched a folded letter with trembling hands. "Jane, I must speak with you in absolute confidence," she began without preamble. "Arthur has been behaving most strangely since yesterday's dreadful events. He locked himself in his study all evening, muttering about old business coming back to haunt us. This morning I found this letter hidden in his desk drawer while searching for stamps. The letter, dated 3 weeks earlier, was from Eleanor Blackwood. Its contents transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the entire situation. Eleanor had not been seeking confrontation with Colonel Bantry, but rather his assistance as a witness to events at Enderby Hall. She had written requesting his help in clearing her name, believing he might remember crucial details about the night Lady Ashford's diamond bracelet disappeared. But Arthur never mentioned knowing this woman. Mrs. Bantry continued, her voice breaking slightly. When she appeared at the garden party, he gave no sign of recognition. Why would he conceal their correspondence? And Jane, there's something else. His fox-head waistcoat buttons. One has been missing since yesterday afternoon, and he became quite distressed when I mentioned it at breakfast. Miss Marple's mind worked rapidly through the implications. The letter suggested Eleanor had viewed the colonel as a potential ally rather than an adversary, yet his concealment of their correspondence and the loss of his distinctive button at the quarry painted a more sinister picture. "Tell me, Dolly," Miss Marple said gently, "what exactly did Arthur say about remembering Mrs. Blackwood?" "He mentioned she had been companion to old Lady Ashford, said there was some unpleasant business with missing jewelry. He claimed the whole affair was exaggerated, but he seemed genuinely shaken by her appearance. He kept saying, 'I thought that business was dead and buried.' Over and over." After Mrs. Bantry's departure, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where she found Leonard Clement in his study, surrounded by parish records and looking thoroughly harassed. When she mentioned the Danes family and the charitable assistance they had received after young George's accident, the vicar's expression grew troubled. "That was a most unfortunate situation," he admitted, removing his spectacles to clean them with unusual deliberation. The boy had become involved with some unsavory characters who were using the servants' quarters at various great houses for their activities. Lady Ashford was anxious to avoid scandal, so a quiet settlement was arranged. The family was provided with funds to make a fresh start elsewhere. "And Miss Eleanor Miller?" Miss Marple inquired. "Was she also compensated for the damage to her reputation?" Leonard's face darkened. "That has always troubled my conscience. She was dismissed without references along with the boy, though there was never any evidence against her personally. I often wondered if she was merely convenient to sacrifice." This revelation confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the systematic nature of the cover-up. Eleanor had not been randomly accused, but deliberately framed to deflect attention from the real thief. Someone had benefited enormously from that long-ago crime, using the stolen bracelet's value to establish themselves in comfortable circumstances. Her afternoon investigation at the village surgery proved equally illuminating. Dr. Haydock's receptionist mentioned that he had received an unexpected visitor yesterday morning, a woman who insisted on discussing old business and left him visibly shaken. The timing suggested Eleanor had been systematically working through a list of people connected to the Enderby Hall scandal, perhaps gathering evidence or seeking allies for her vindication. Most significantly, Miss Marple's careful examination of the crime scene photographs revealed that the letter opener's handle bore faint scratches consistent with being gripped by someone wearing heavy rings. The pattern suggested not panic, but deliberate force, applied by hands accustomed to giving orders and taking what they wanted. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web Eleanor's return had exposed. The theft of Lady Ashford's bracelet had not been a simple crime of opportunity, but the foundation stone of someone's entire subsequent life. The real thief had watched Eleanor's systematic investigation with growing horror, knowing that her determination to clear her name would inevitably expose the carefully constructed lies of 20 years. James Blackwood remained in custody, his protests of innocence falling on deaf ears as Inspector Slack prepared his case. Yet Miss Marple suspected the solicitor's legal training had led him to recognize the true killer's identity, and his stubborn silence suggested he was protecting someone, perhaps believing his professional skills could secure a lesser sentence through claims of self-defense. The woman who had signed the visitor's book twice had indeed been living two lives, but her killer had ensured that neither Eleanor Fortescue nor Eleanor Blackwood would survive to tell their story. The truth lay buried beneath 20 years of respectability, but Miss Marple sensed it was finally beginning to surface, bringing with it consequences that would shake St. Mary Mead to its very foundations. The morning following Miss Marple's discovery of Colonel Bantry's button brought an atmosphere of barely contained tension to St. Mary Mead. News of Eleanor Blackwood's systematic investigation had spread through the village's informal networks, and several residents found themselves confronting uncomfortable memories they had hoped to keep buried forever. Miss Marple, observing the subtle changes in behavior from her garden gate, recognized the signs of a community under strain. Mrs. Bantry arrived at Danemead Cottage shortly after breakfast, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by barely controlled anxiety. She clutched a manila envelope containing correspondence she had discovered hidden in her husband's desk, her hands trembling as she explained her growing fears about Arthur's connection to the tragedy. "Jane, I must know the truth," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the lane. "Arthur has been pacing his study all night, muttering about old debts coming due and consequences that can't be avoided. When I found these letters from Mrs. Blackwood, I realized he had been deceiving me about knowing her." Miss Marple examined the correspondence with careful attention. Eleanor's letters revealed a woman methodically building a case for her vindication, requesting specific details about the night of Lady Ashford's house party and the subsequent investigation. Her tone was measured but determined, suggesting someone who had spent 20 years preparing for this moment of reckoning. "She wrote to Arthur 3 weeks ago," Mrs. Bantry continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Asked him to confirm what he witnessed that night at Enderby Hall. She mentioned having found a witness who could corroborate her story, someone who had been too frightened to speak at the time but was now willing to tell the truth." The implications were staggering. Eleanor had not returned to St. Mary Mead impulsively, but had been methodically gathering evidence and witnesses to support her case. Her appearance at the garden party had been the culmination of weeks of careful preparation, not a casual visit motivated by nostalgia. Miss Marple's subsequent visit to Colonel Bantry, ostensibly to return a borrowed book on military history, provided crucial insights into the man's psychological state. She found him in his study, surrounded by old photographs and newspaper clippings, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled and his manner agitated. "Terrible business at the vicarage," he began without preamble, his military bearing undermined by obvious distress. "These London types, bringing their troubles to peaceful villages, should have stayed where she belonged instead of stirring up old scandals." Miss Marple settled herself in the leather armchair, her knitting needles clicking with deceptive casualness. "Yet I understand you had some slight acquaintance with Mrs. Blackwood from earlier years. The Enderby Hall affair, I believe." The effect of her words was immediate and telling. Colonel Bantry's face flushed, his hands clenched involuntarily, and his eyes darted toward the desk drawer where he had hastily concealed Eleanor's letters upon her arrival. "Knew of the business, certainly," he replied with forced brusqueness. "Unpleasant affair involving missing jewelry and accusations against the servants. But that was 20 years ago, Jane. No reason to drag it all up again." Miss Marple's gentle persistence gradually extracted admissions that painted a damning picture of the Colonel's past. He revealed that his return from India had coincided with a period of financial difficulty, that his subsequent prosperity had come from fortunate investments he was reluctant to detail, and that he had indeed been present at Lady Ashford's final house party. Most significantly, when Miss Marple casually mentioned finding a distinctive silver button near the old quarry, Colonel Bantry's composure cracked entirely. His hand went instinctively to his waistcoat. His face paled, and he began stammering excuses about losing buttons during country walks. "The quarry path can be treacherous," Miss Marple observed innocently. "I understand Mrs. Blackwood visited there on the afternoon of her death. Meeting someone about old business, perhaps." Colonel Bantry's distress was now unmistakable. He admitted, with obvious reluctance, that Eleanor had indeed contacted him about meeting at the quarry to discuss mutual concerns regarding the Enderby Hall incident. He claimed to have declined the meeting, but his manner suggested otherwise. Miss Marple's afternoon was spent visiting George Danes at his lodgings above the Blue Boar. The limping man, initially suspicious and defensive, gradually revealed the full extent of his knowledge about the events of 1934. His testimony was devastating in its simplicity and detail. "I was returning late from an errand when I saw him," Danes explained, his weathered face heavy with years of suppressed guilt. Young officer in evening dress, slipping down the servant's stair with something clutched in his hand. Moved like he owned the place, confident as you please. It was the fox head cufflinks that caught the lamplight. Same ones he still wears to church every Sunday. The witness had kept silent for 20 years, intimidated by threats against his family's livelihood and later by the accident at the quarry that had left him permanently disabled. Eleanor's return had finally given him the courage to speak, but her death had terrified him into considering flight from the village. "She promised me justice," he whispered, his hands shaking as he poured tea with painful deliberation. "Said she had evidence, documents that would prove what really happened. But now she's dead, and I'm just a limping nobody with a story no one will believe." Miss Marple's gentle encouragement convinced him to remain in St. Mary Mead long enough for the truth to emerge. She assured him that Eleanor's careful documentation had created a trail of evidence that even the most respectable criminals could not entirely erase. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of guilt and fear that Eleanor's return had exposed. The theft of Lady Ashford's bracelet had not been a crime of opportunity, but the foundation stone of Colonel Bantry's entire subsequent life. His prosperity, his marriage, his position in society, all had been built on that single act of theft and the systematic destruction of an innocent woman's reputation. Eleanor's methodical investigation had threatened to topple this carefully constructed edifice, making her death not a crime of passion, but a calculated act of self-preservation. The Colonel had followed her to the vicarage after learning from Danes that his secret was finally about to be exposed, and had struck with the desperate efficiency of a man protecting everything he held dear. Yet something in the pattern still troubled Miss Marple. The precision of the attack, the intimate knowledge of the vicarage layout, the ability to move through the house during the garden party without attracting attention. These details suggested a familiarity with the crime scene that went beyond casual acquaintance. The woman who had signed the visitors' book twice had indeed returned to reclaim her stolen honor, but her killer possessed advantages that Colonel Bantry, for all his guilt, might not have enjoyed. The final revelation, Miss Marple suspected, would prove even more shocking than the village was prepared to accept. As she prepared for what she sensed would be the investigation's crucial phase, Miss Marple recognized that the truth about Eleanor Blackwood's death lay not just in the distant past of Enderby Hall, but in the more recent relationships and rivalries that had shaped life in St. Mary Mead itself. The morning following Miss Marple's discovery of Colonel Bantry's button brought an atmosphere of barely contained tension to St. Mary Mead. The village seemed to hold its breath, as though sensing that the careful facade of respectability was about to crack under the weight of long-buried secrets. Miss Marple, observing from her garden gate with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades studying human nature, recognized the signs of a community under strain. Her morning was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, whose usual blustering confidence had been replaced by barely controlled frustration. He carried with him news that transformed her understanding of the investigation's current phase. Sometime during the night, the vicarage had been burgled. The target had been highly specific. Eleanor's diary, which had been secured in a locked drawer of the inspector's temporary office, had been stolen with surgical precision. Professional job, Slack admitted grudgingly, his pride clearly wounded by the security breach. Lock picked clean, nothing else disturbed. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were after and where to find it. Miss Marple's mind immediately grasped the implications. The diary's theft confirmed that Eleanor's killer was still at large and desperately afraid of what her careful documentation might reveal. More significantly, the burglar had possessed intimate knowledge of the vicarage layout and the inspector's temporary arrangements, knowledge that suggested someone with regular access to the house. Most instructive, she murmured, her knitting needles clicking with thoughtful rhythm. Someone was sufficiently terrified of that diary's contents to risk exposure through burglary. The question becomes, who had both the motivation and the opportunity for such precise theft? Her subsequent visit to the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss flower arrangements for Sunday service, allowed her to observe the household's reactions to the break-in. Leonard Clement appeared genuinely distressed by the violation of his home, his clerical composure strained by the implications of harboring criminal activity. Griselda, however, displayed a nervousness that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances, her hands trembling as she served tea with unusual clumsiness. "Such a terrible thing," Griselda whispered, glancing repeatedly toward the hallway where the burglary had occurred. "To think that someone could enter our home so easily, take what they pleased. It makes one feel quite vulnerable." Miss Marple noted the particular emphasis on vulnerability, as though Griselda feared the theft was merely the beginning of more serious threats. When questioned about household security, the younger woman revealed that spare keys were kept on hooks in the kitchen, a detail that would have been known to anyone familiar with the vicarage's domestic arrangements. Dr. Haydock's afternoon visit provided additional context that deepened the mystery's complexity. He revealed that Eleanor had consulted him 3 days before her death, not for medical treatment, but to discuss her growing fears about returning to St. Mary Mead. She had mentioned receiving anonymous warnings about stirring up old business and had expressed particular concern about someone she referred to only as the real beneficiary. She seemed convinced that the person who had profited from her disgrace was still living in the village, Dr. Haydock explained, his usually genial manner sobered by the memory. Said she had evidence that would expose not just the theft of Lady Ashford's bracelet, but a pattern of deception that had continued for 20 years. This revelation aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the systematic nature of the cover-up. Eleanor's return had not been motivated by simple vindictiveness, but by a determination to expose someone who had built their entire respectable existence on the foundation of her ruined reputation. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the person of George Danes, who appeared at Miss Marple's gate with obvious reluctance and considerable fear. He carried a crumpled note that had been pushed under his door during the night, an anonymous warning written in block capitals that advised him to leave while accidents could still be avoided. Miss Marple examined the handwriting with careful attention, noting the distinctive formation of certain letters that triggered a memory of church notices and village announcements. The hand was familiar, though disguised, suggesting someone accustomed to public writing who had attempted to mask their natural style. "Someone is becoming increasingly desperate," she observed, returning the note to Danes. "First the diary theft, now threats against witnesses. Our killer is discovering that murder creates more problems than it solves. As evening shadows lengthened across the village, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that was emerging from the day's revelations. The burglary had been executed with intimate knowledge of the vicarage. The anonymous threats suggested someone with access to the village's social networks, and Eleanor's fear of the real beneficiary pointed towards someone whose current position depended entirely on maintaining their carefully constructed past. The woman who had signed the visitor's book twice had returned to reclaim both her identities, but her killer was fighting desperately to preserve the fiction that had shaped their entire adult life. Miss Marple sensed that the final confrontation was approaching, a moment when 20 years of deception would collide with an old woman's quiet determination to see justice done. The truth lay not in distant scandals or obvious suspects, but in the careful observation of human nature under pressure. Someone in St. Mary Mead was discovering that the price of respectability, when built on others' suffering, eventually came due with interest that could only be paid in blood. Miss Marple spent the morning following the diary theft in what appeared to be routine social calls, though each visit served a calculated purpose in her methodical psychological campaign. Her strategy was simple, yet devastating, to create an atmosphere of mounting pressure that would force the killer to reveal themselves through their own desperate actions. She began by casually mentioning to Mrs. Price Ridley that Eleanor had been most methodical about keeping copies of important documents, then observed with satisfaction as this information spread through the village's efficient gossip network like ripples across a pond. The effect was immediate and telling. By midday, several residents displayed the particular nervousness of people who feared their secrets were about to be exposed. Miss Marple noted with professional interest how certain individuals avoided her gaze, how conversations ceased abruptly upon her approach, and how the very air seemed thick with unspoken anxiety. Someone was feeling the pressure of her quiet scrutiny, and that someone was growing increasingly desperate. Her afternoon tea party invitation had been carefully orchestrated to create maximum psychological impact. She had specifically requested the presence of Griselda Clement, Colonel Bantry, and George Danes, explaining to each that it would be so helpful to have all the witnesses together to discuss poor Mrs. Blackwood's final day. The setting was deliberately intimate. Her small sitting room with its comfortable chairs arranged in a circle that would make evasion impossible. Colonel Bantry arrived first, his usual military bearing undermined by obvious distress. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted his teacup, and Miss Marple noticed how his eyes kept darting to the window as though contemplating escape. When she casually mentioned that distinctive personal items have such a way of turning up in the most revealing places, his face went ashen and he nearly dropped his cup entirely. Griselda Clement entered with her customary social grace, but Miss Marple's trained eye detected the subtle signs of strain beneath the polished exterior. The younger woman's smile required visible effort. Her hands moved with the controlled precision of someone fighting to maintain composure, and there was a quality to her attention that suggested she was listening for meanings beneath the surface of every word. George Danes, uncomfortable in borrowed formal attire, positioned himself near the door with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust in the permanence of safety. His presence served multiple purposes. As witness to past events, as evidence of Eleanor's systematic investigation, and as a reminder that secrets buried for 20 years could still surface to demand justice. Miss Marple began with seemingly innocent observations about the weather and the upcoming church bazaar, allowing her guests to settle into false security before introducing the first carefully calculated revelation. "I've been thinking about poor Mrs. Blackwood's systematic approach to clearing her name," she remarked, her knitting needles clicking with deceptive casualness. Such a methodical woman. She posted 3 registered letters on the afternoon of her death, you know. One to a solicitor, one to a newspaper archive, and one to Lady Ashford's surviving relatives. Insurance, one might call it. The reaction was immediate and varied. Colonel Bantry's military composure cracked visibly. Danes looked up with sudden hope, but it was Griselda's response that proved most illuminating. Her teacup rattled against its saucer for just an instant before her training reasserted itself. But that moment of unguarded shock told Miss Marple everything she needed to know about who had the most to fear from Eleanor's careful preparations. "Of course," Miss Marple continued in the same gentle tone. "Physical evidence has its own story to tell. Inspector Slack discovered the most interesting items, a distinctive silver button near the quarry where Mrs. Blackwood met with Mr. Danes, and traces of green fabric caught on the writing desk where she died. Such telling details, don't you think?" Colonel Bantry's face went grey with terror. "My God, Jane, you can't possibly think that The button must have fallen when I was walking. I never meant for any of this to happen." "Oh, my dear Arthur," Miss Marple interrupted with surprising gentleness. "I don't think you killed Mrs. Blackwood at all. Your button at the quarry merely confirms that you kept your appointment with her, as she requested in her letter. She needed you as a witness to what Mr. Danes had to tell her about the night at Enderby Hall. You saw the real thief 20 years ago, didn't you? A young woman slipping through the corridors with Lady Ashford's bracelet clutched in her hand." The silence that followed was profound and electric. Griselda's face had gone perfectly still, her social mask finally slipping to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. When she spoke, her voice carried a quality that none of them had heard before, harder, more desperate, stripped of its usual warmth. "You're speaking in riddles again, Miss Marple. I have no idea what you're suggesting." Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythm. "I think you do, my dear. You see, Mrs. Blackwood didn't return to St. Mary Mead merely seeking vindication for Eleanor Miller's disgrace. She had discovered something far more significant, that Margaret Miller, her former companion who had escaped disgrace by making a fortunate marriage, was living quite comfortably as Mrs. Leonard Clement, the respected vicar's wife. The transformation in Griselda was startling. Her carefully maintained composure shattered like glass, revealing the desperate woman beneath. "She was going to destroy everything," she whispered, her voice thick with 20 years of suppressed fear. "My marriage, Leonard's career, our entire life. For what? A bracelet that belonged to a dead woman who had more jewelry than she could ever wear." George Danes leaned forward, his weathered face filled with sudden understanding. "You were the one I saw that night. Not a servant, not a guest. The other companion. You took the bracelet and let Eleanor take the blame." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "Eleanor signed the visitor's book twice because she recognized you, Griselda. Margaret Miller had become Mrs. Clement, but the handwriting, the mannerisms, the way you moved through the house, all remained the same. She knew she had found not just the person who had stolen Lady Ashford's bracelet, but the person who had deliberately destroyed her life to cover the crime." The final piece of the psychological test came with Miss Marple's next observation, delivered with the quiet authority of absolute certainty. "That is why you followed her into the morning room during the garden party. Eleanor had decided to speak with Leonard directly, to tell him the truth about his wife's past. She turned her back on you, perhaps to gather her thoughts, never imagining that gentle, respectable Mrs. Clement would pick up the letter opener from her own husband's desk." Griselda's reaction was immediate and damning, not denial, but a flash of raw terror at the accuracy of details that only the killer could know. In that instant, before she could recover her composure, every person in the room saw the truth written clearly across her face. Inspector Slack, who had been listening from the hallway, stepped into the room with quiet authority. "Mrs. Griselda Clement," he said formally, "I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Blackwood." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Miss Marple reflected sadly on the waste of it all. A young woman's desperate act had created decades of deception, ultimately leading to murder when the past finally caught up with the present. The visitor who had signed the guest book twice had indeed been reclaiming both her identities, but her killer had been fighting desperately to prevent the exposure of a third identity. Margaret Miller, the thief who had become Mrs. Clement through blood and lies. The truth was finally emerging, though its full revelation would bring pain to many innocent people who had trusted in appearances, rather than looking beneath the surface of respectability. As Griselda was led away, her mask of genteel propriety finally abandoned, Miss Marple knew that St. Mary Mead would never quite be the same again. The confession came with surprising swiftness once Griselda realized her carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled. In Inspector Slack's makeshift interview room at the village police station, the woman who had been Margaret Miller, then Griselda Clement, finally told the truth about 20 years of systematic deception. She had stolen Lady Ashford's diamond bracelet in a moment of desperate poverty, then deliberately planted evidence to implicate Eleanor when suspicion began to focus on the companions. The bracelet's sale had provided the capital to reinvent herself as a respectable widow, positioning herself to catch the eye of an idealistic young curate whose career she had carefully guided towards St. Mary Mead. Leonard Clement received the news in his study, surrounded by theological texts that suddenly seemed inadequate to address the magnitude of his wife's betrayal. When Miss Marple visited him the following morning, she found a man whose faith in human goodness had been profoundly shaken, yet whose essential decency remained intact. "I should have seen the signs," he said quietly, staring at his hands. The way she avoided certain topics, her reluctance to speak of her past, the careful way she managed every social situation. I thought it was natural reserve, but it was actually calculated concealment. Miss Marple's needles clicked with gentle sympathy. She was extraordinarily skilled at presenting the face people expected to see Leonard. You saw a devoted wife and gracious hostess because that was the performance she had perfected over decades. Even I didn't suspect until Eleanor's return forced her to reveal her true nature. The final evidence emerged during the search of the vicarage. Hidden behind a loose panel in Griselda's dressing table, Inspector Slack discovered the original setting of Lady Ashford's bracelet, stripped of its diamonds, but still bearing the distinctive maker's mark that confirmed Eleanor's accusations. Alongside it lay Eleanor's stolen diary, its pages providing the detailed timeline of betrayal that Griselda had been unable to destroy despite her desperate midnight burglary. James Blackwood was released immediately, his relief tempered by the bitter knowledge that his wife's vindication had come at the cost of her life. Before leaving St. Mary Mead, he visited Miss Marple to express his gratitude and share Eleanor's final letter, which had predicted that Miss Marple will see what others miss, for she understands that human nature reveals itself in the smallest gestures. The village struggled to absorb the implications of Griselda's deception. Leonard Clement submitted his resignation to the bishop, explaining with quiet dignity that his continued presence would be an impediment to the spiritual comfort of both parishioners and priest. His final sermon, delivered to a packed church, spoke simply of forgiveness and the danger of building one's house upon sand. George Danes, finally freed from 20 years of fearful silence, found employment on a neighboring estate with Colonel Bantry's recommendation. The colonel himself, chastened by his brush with suspicion and the exposure of his moral cowardice, retreated into a quieter life, his military bearing humbled by the recognition of his failure to speak when truth demanded courage. Mrs. Bantry threw herself into charitable work with renewed vigor, as though good deeds might compensate for years of willful blindness to uncomfortable truth. The village gossips found their appetite for scandal strangely diminished by the reality of murder in their midst, the realization that a killer could hide behind perfect respectability, making every neighbor seem suddenly unfamiliar. As autumn deepened into winter, Miss Marple often reflected on the woman who had signed the visitor's book twice. Eleanor Blackwood had returned to St. Mary Mead seeking not revenge, but restoration, the return of her good name and acknowledgement of 20 years of injustice. Her methodical investigation had been motivated by a profound need for truth rather than vindictiveness, and though she had not lived to see her vindication, her careful documentation had ensured that justice would ultimately prevail. The visitor's book remained at the vicarage, a silent testament to Eleanor's dual identity, once as the person she had been forced to become, and once as the person she had always been. Miss Marple had suggested to young Cherry Baker that the pages not be removed, for one never knows when old entries may prove useful. Walking through her garden on a crisp December evening, Miss Marple paused to tend her roses with the same careful attention she applied to unraveling human mysteries. The case had revealed once again that beneath the surface of village respectability lay currents of passion, greed, and fear that could, under the right circumstances, erupt into violence. Human nature, she murmured to herself, snipping a faded bloom. Always the same patterns. Desperation leading to deception, deception necessitating greater crimes to maintain itself. Poor Griselda built her castle on sand and was surprised when the tide came in. The mystery of the double signature had been solved, but its lessons would linger in St. Mary Mead for years to come. Miss Marple gathered her gardening tools and headed inside, reflecting that justice, like the seasons, moved according to its own inexorable rhythms. Eleanor Blackwood had waited 20 years for vindication, and though she had not lived to see it, truth had ultimately triumphed over the most carefully constructed deceptions. As she settled into her chair with her knitting, Miss Marple offered a quiet prayer for the woman who had lived 2 lives, hoping she had finally found the peace and recognition that had been denied her in life. The comfortable rhythms of village existence would continue, but St. Mary Mead had learned anew that appearances could deceive, and that sometimes the most dangerous visitor was not the stranger at the gate, but the past returning to demand acknowledgement. The trial of Griselda Clement unfolded during the gray days of early winter, transforming the county courthouse into a theater where St. Mary Mead's carefully maintained illusions were systematically dismantled. The prosecution presented Eleanor's recovered diary, George Dane's long-suppressed testimony about the night at Enderby Hall, and the damning physical evidence that linked the vicar's wife to both the original theft and the recent murder. Griselda maintained her composure throughout the proceedings, though those who had known her recognized that the vivacious hostess had been replaced by someone harder and more calculating, Margaret Miller, finally revealed after decades of careful concealment. The defense attempted to argue temporary insanity, suggesting that Eleanor's sudden reappearance had triggered an uncontrollable reaction in a woman who had spent 20 years fearing exposure. However, the systematic nature of the cover-up, from the planted evidence against Eleanor to the midnight burglary of the diary, painted a portrait of deliberate calculation rather than impulsive panic. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict, and Griselda received a sentence of 15 years, severe enough to satisfy justice, yet tempered by recognition of the desperate circumstances that had led to her original crime. Leonard Clement bore the trial's revelations with a dignity that impressed even those who had initially blamed him for his blindness to his wife's true nature. His final testimony proved particularly moving as he spoke with painful honesty about the small inconsistencies he had noticed over the years but chosen to ignore. Griselda's careful avoidance of certain topics, her reluctance to discuss her past, the calculated way she had steered him toward St. Mary Mead, specifically when other parishes offered better prospect. His resignation had been submitted before the trial's conclusion, and he departed for a quiet chaplaincy in a distant diocese where his gifts for comforting the distressed would be less complicated by personal history. "I love the woman I thought she was," he had said in his final conversation with Miss Marple, standing by her window and looking out at the winter garden. "I failed to see the woman she actually was because I preferred the comfortable fiction to the uncomfortable truth." Perhaps none of us is beyond redemption, but we must first be willing to see ourselves clearly. Miss Marple had found his perspective both heartbreaking and hopeful. "We are never entirely one thing or another, Leonard." Griselda's capacity for deception coexisted with genuine affection for you. The tragedy lies not in her complexity, but in her choice to build her entire life upon another's suffering. The village's healing process proved as complex as the individuals involved. Colonel Bantry, though legally cleared of wrongdoing, remained a diminished figure whose military bearing had been humbled by recognition of his moral cowardice 20 years earlier. His testimony might have spared Eleanor decades of disgrace, yet he had chosen respectability over justice when courage was required. Mrs. Bantry channeled her considerable social energy into charitable work, establishing a fund for women who had been wrongly accused or dismissed from employment without proper investigation, a practical memorial that transformed guilt into constructive action. George Danes, finally freed from 20 years of fearful silence, found employment on a neighboring estate with Colonel Bantry's recommendation. His new position gradually restored the self-respect that life had nearly beaten out of him, and he walked more uprightly now, his limp still pronounced, but no longer the stooped shuffle of a man expecting blows. Truth had given him back his voice, and with it, a measure of dignity. James Blackwood made one final visit to St. Mary Mead before closing the book on his wife's estate. He established a trust fund in Eleanor's name, providing assistance to young women from disadvantaged backgrounds, those who might otherwise face the same vulnerabilities that had once made Eleanor so easily discarded and framed. Before departing, he expressed his profound gratitude to Miss Marple for understanding that Eleanor's return had been motivated not by vindictiveness, but by a fundamental need for restoration. "She always said you were the only person in this village she truly respected," he confided. "Even as a girl, she noticed how you watched people, how you saw the shadows behind the smiles. You gave her the vindication she sought, even if she didn't live to enjoy it." The visitor's book remained at the vicarage, its double signature serving as a permanent reminder of the woman who had returned to reclaim both her identities. Eleanor Blackwood had signed once as the person she had been forced to become, and once as the person she had always been, a final, defiant act of self-assertion that had ultimately led to both her death and her vindication. As spring returned to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple often reflected on the case while tending her garden. The mystery of the double signature had proven deceptively simple, yet it had revealed the complex layers of deception that could accumulate over decades when comfortable lies were preferred to uncomfortable truths. Eleanor had spent 20 years as two people, the disgraced Eleanor Fortescue and the innocent Eleanor Blackwood, and her killer had spent the same period as three: Margaret Miller, the thief, Griselda Clement, the respectable wife, and the calculating murderer who would kill to protect her carefully constructed life. Walking through the village on a warm evening, Miss Marple paused at the church where Leonard Clement had once preached about building houses on solid foundations. The irony was profound. Griselda had built her entire existence on the sand of deception, and when the tide of truth finally came in, everything had been swept away. Yet from the wreckage had emerged a kind of justice, delayed but not denied, that honored both Eleanor's memory and the patient work of those who refused to let comfortable lies stand unchallenged. "Human nature," she murmured to herself, the familiar refrain that had guided her through countless mysteries. Always the same patterns, the same weaknesses, the same inevitable consequences when we choose expediency over truth. The case was closed, but its lessons would linger in St. Mary Mead for years to come. Miss Marple gathered her gardening tools and headed inside, reflecting that the greatest mysteries were often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to observe, wise enough to understand, and brave enough to speak the truth regardless of consequences. The woman who had signed the visitor's book twice had finally found the peace that had been denied her in life, and justice, like the seasons, had moved according to its own inexorable rhythms toward a resolution that honored both mercy and truth. The spring that followed Griselda Clement's conviction settled over St. Mary Mead with the gentle persistence of healing, bringing with it subtle but profound changes that Miss Marple observed from her customary garden chair. The chestnut trees by the green wore new leaves of tender green, and the vicarage garden, now overseen by the cheerful Reverend Alistair Finch and his energetic young family, showed cautious signs of revival. Yet beneath this surface renewal, the village carried within it a chastened awareness of how thoroughly appearances could deceive, and how dangerous it could be to choose comfort over uncomfortable truth. Miss Marple noticed the transformation in small but telling details. Mrs. Price Ridley, once so eager to deliver judgment on the slightest irregularity, now spoke with notable restraint when discussing others' failings. The younger women of the village listened with greater skepticism to pronouncements about character being deducible from clothes and manners. Even Cherry Baker had acquired a seriousness that sat oddly on her youthful features, no longer quite so inclined to treat village gossip as harmless entertainment. The Eleanor Blackwood Memorial Trust, established by James Blackwood before his departure from St. Mary Mead, had begun its quiet but meaningful work. Within 6 months, it had already assisted 17 young women facing circumstances similar to those Eleanor had endured, providing employment references, legal advocacy, and educational opportunities that transformed her suffering into practical assistance for others. Blackwood wrote periodically to Miss Marple, his letters reflecting a man who had found purpose in ensuring that his wife's vindication served a greater good than mere personal satisfaction. Leonard Clement's correspondence from his distant chaplaincy revealed a man who had discovered an unexpected gift for ministering to those burdened by guilt and regret. His letters to Miss Marple contained observations that demonstrated how profoundly the revelation of his wife's deception had shaped his understanding of human nature. "I've learned," he wrote in one particularly moving passage, "that repentance is far more complicated than I once preached from the pulpit. Some sins are obvious. Others consist of what we have failed to see because seeing would have demanded more courage than we possessed. I find now that I can offer comfort to those struggling with similar blindness, drawing perhaps on my own experience of loving someone whose true nature I failed to perceive." Colonel Bantry had aged noticeably during the months following the trial, his military bearing permanently humbled by recognition of his moral failure 20 years earlier. He spent increasing amounts of time writing what he described as a memoir about the dangers of choosing respectability over conscience, tormented by thoughts of how different Eleanor's life might have been had he possessed the courage to speak truth when it mattered most. Mrs. Bantry channeled her considerable social energy into charitable work, establishing support for women who had been wrongly dismissed from employment without proper investigation. A practical memorial that transformed guilt into constructive action. George Danes had blossomed in his new position under Colonel Bantry's recommendation, his natural intelligence finally receiving the recognition it deserved. His transformation from fearful, limping outcast to respected head gardener on Lord Enderby's estate demonstrated how profoundly circumstances could shape a person's capabilities. Truth had restored not just his voice, but his entire sense of self-worth, and though his limp remained, he no longer carried himself like a man expecting blows. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Miss Marple's nephew Raymond West found her in her garden, his sophisticated curiosity about the case providing an opportunity for reflection that proved more illuminating than his London perspective might have suggested. "It really is quite remarkable, Aunt Jane," Raymond observed, lighting a cigarette with characteristic flourish. "To think that Griselda Clement was capable of such sustained duplicity. The two identities, the stolen jewels, the past returning to haunt the present, it defies belief." "On the contrary, dear," Miss Marple replied, her attention momentarily focused on a patch of bindweed threatening her delphiniums. "It is entirely believable. You see, Griselda did not have two identities in the way poor Eleanor did. Eleanor was fractured by circumstance, Griselda was fractured by choice. She simply decided that the person she wished to be was more important than the person she actually was, and she was willing to destroy anyone who threatened that illusion. Raymond exhaled thoughtfully. But Eleanor's mistake with the guest book, that was the key, wasn't it? A psychological slip that revealed everything? Eleanor signed the book twice, Miss Marple corrected gently, not from confusion, but from determination. She wanted to leave a record, knowing she might not survive her visit. That second signature was both an act of reclamation and a witness statement. She was telling us that Eleanor Blackwood was present, even if the world only saw Mrs. Fortescue. It was a very brave thing to do. The visitor's book remained at the vicarage, despite Mrs. Finch's initial inclination to start fresh with a new volume. Miss Marple had gently discouraged this impulse, explaining that history has its lessons, and we honor the dead by remembering rather than erasing. When Mrs. Finch showed her the book during a courtesy call, Miss Marple opened it to that fateful September page where the two signatures sat one atop the other, Mrs. Eleanor Fortescue in the polite, constrained script of social necessity, and Eleanor Blackwood flowing beneath it, bold and unashamed. "I think you should keep it," Miss Marple said softly, closing the book with reverent care. "The past is not something to be discarded, my dear. It is the soil from which the future grows. We must remember the visitors who have passed through, for they teach us who we are." Walking home through the twilight, Miss Marple paused at the churchyard, where a new headstone had recently been erected, paid for by the trust James Blackwood had established. It bore a simple inscription that neither hid the truth nor embellished it: Eleanor Blackwood. She returned home. The words captured both the tragedy and the triumph of a woman who had spent 20 years as two people, the disgraced Eleanor Fortescue and the innocent Eleanor Blackwood, and had finally, in death, been allowed to be herself. As the village settled into evening, lights flickering on in cottage windows and the familiar rhythms of life continuing unbroken, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring lessons of the case. The mystery of the visitor who signed the guest book twice had revealed that the most dangerous deceptions were those practiced by people who understood social conventions well enough to manipulate them perfectly. Griselda had been a masterful performer, presenting exactly the image each situation required, until Eleanor's return had forced her to reveal the calculating survivor beneath the carefully maintained facade. Miss Marple gathered her gardening tools and headed inside, reflecting that human nature, in all its complexity and contradiction, remained the greatest mystery of all. People constructed elaborate fictions to protect themselves from uncomfortable truths, and those fictions could persist for decades until someone brave or desperate enough challenged them. Eleanor Blackwood had been both brave and desperate, and though her challenge had cost her life, it had ultimately restored her honor and transformed her suffering into a legacy that would help others facing similar injustices. The woman who had signed the visitor's book twice had finally found peace, and the village she had left behind would continue, as it always had, beneath its surface of respectability, though perhaps with a slightly more skeptical eye toward appearances and a greater appreciation for the courage required to speak uncomfortable truth. Justice had been served, though at a cost that reminded everyone involved that truth, while ultimately liberating, could exact a terrible price from those who pursued it and those who tried to suppress it. As Miss Marple settled into her chair with her knitting, she offered a quiet prayer for Eleanor Blackwood, hoping she had finally found the recognition and peace that had been denied her in life. The comfortable rhythms of village existence would continue, but St. Mary Mead had learned anew that the greatest mysteries often lay hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to observe, wise enough to understand, and brave enough to speak the truth regardless of consequences.